So I feel like in all the educational spaces that I've worked in, there's been a real lack of sort of coaching for kids to have more strong and resilient mindset. Now, it's all very well having lots of academic knowledge or having lots of transferable skills in terms of, I don't know, maths or coding or something like that, but having mental models that you can use to cope with what life throws at you is something that schools should be delivering to all our young people. So a little while ago, I made a video on this channel about 5 things that I thought would make kids more effective learners, and now I'm going to switch tack a little bit and talk about 5 things that I think would improve kids' mindset. So I've tried to narrow this down to 5 ideas that I think would improve kids' mindset and kind of make more robust and resilient kids who are prepared for life outside the school gates, not just for the academic stresses of their life. Growth versus fixed mindset. So this one has been a real game changer for me, and it's probably one of the most life-changing paradigm shifts that I've had in my entire life, shifting from a fixed mindset towards a more growth mindset. So when I was very young, I was told by a lot of teachers that I was gifted in the fields of language and literacy and those sorts of areas. And having those adults say those things to me really began the process of me developing a fixed mindset. As a young person, I genuinely believed that I had concrete strengths and weaknesses and that they were very fixed and that there was really nothing I could do to change those things. So for me, this meant that I had a solid belief that I was gifted at reading and writing, but I also built up this belief alongside that I was no good at other things. The one that springs to my mind is maths. So from a young age, I just completely switched off from that subject and I sort of compartmentalized it as something that I just couldn't do and I was no good at. I thought to myself, I'm exceptional at reading and writing, but at the same time, I just can't do maths. It's not for me. It's not in my wheelhouse. And it built a sort of very rigid, fixed mindset about those things, about both my strengths and my weaknesses. So as well as maths and STEM being really essential for a lot of careers nowadays, we now know how key maths and mathematical problem solving is in developing cognitive function, and we now know that doing maths has many, many benefits for the development of the brain. So obviously I have massive regrets now about shunning that subject from such an early age as something that was not for me. So nowadays I'm trying to counteract those many years of missed opportunities in the field of maths by using things like Brilliant to do maths problem solving by myself. But as well as just trying to develop my math skills, I'm using Brilliant to try and develop this growth mindset a bit more and sort of to reteach myself that those things that I perceive myself to be bad at, that's not a fixed state. That's something that I can change over time if I want to. So I'm gently trying to guide myself away from having a fixed mindset towards having more of a growth mindset. Now, in terms of kids, it's very tempting to kind of commodify kids and give them sort of attributes based on what you see their strengths and weaknesses are in a given point in time or in a given sort of scenario or situation. But that can be really damaging and detrimental in terms of giving kids very false beliefs about themselves and also about kind of hampering their process and stopping them from attacking those weak areas and bringing them up to the level of their strengths. So in her book Mindset, Carol Dweck describes the growth mindset as a mind that is invigorated by the power of yet, while the fixed mindset is a mind gripped by the tyranny of now. And that's a really, really interesting sort of illustration of the point that just because a child is in a certain position on this particular day, at this particular time in their development, does not mean that they cannot develop and change their strengths and weaknesses as they grow older and as time goes by. So praising kids for their natural abilities or for their intelligence may feel like the natural thing to do at the time because it feels like a form of encouragement, but actually it can be very damaging in terms of arresting the development of that growth mindset and giving kids a more kind of fixed view of what their capabilities are at a young age. The aggregation of marginal gains. Dave Brailsford took charge of the British cycling team at a time when they hadn't won major honours in a major competition for decades. He transformed them into perhaps the most successful sporting team on the planet. So he achieved this through what he calls the aggregation of marginal gains. He took the sport of cycling and looked at every tiny facet that goes into it, from technique, training schedules, footwear, outfits, sleep, nutrition, and perhaps most importantly, mindset. Then he went about seeking a 1% increase in every single one of these areas. So that meant trialing different pillows for different athletes to sleep on, different sports gels for different athletes to ingest at different times of the day, and the list goes on. And through the aggregation of these tiny, tiny improvements, he was able to take a team who couldn't find a win and transform it into a team who basically couldn't lose. So what can our kids learn from this method? Brailsford was very clear in his process about separating the dreams of his athletes from their targets. Dreams can be large and grandiose and far off into the future, but targets ought to be short, simple, and very targeted to the here and now. So what matters here is a shift from focusing on the results at the end of a process into the tiny increments that make up that process, from the end goal to the process itself, and demonstrating to kids that the tiny, tiny improvements they make day on day can actually compound into something phenomenal if they have the patience. So James Clear's book Atomic Habits really delves into how tiny 1% changes over time can compound into absolutely staggering transformations if given enough time. Toleration of ambiguity. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I went on a 4-week training course to get my English teaching as a foreign language certificate, and there was a session that was run by one of the tutors there all about toleration of ambiguity. What the tutor explained was that people who can tolerate not having all of the answers to something right away often have much better learning outcomes in the end, and also have a much less stressful experience in learning but also in life more generally. So looking back, I realised that when I was a learner, I was very, very intolerant of ambiguity, and actually that held me back a lot in terms of my personal development and my growth as a learner. For example, I'd really resist taking notes in any of my classes at school school because I thought that maybe I might change my note-taking system down the line, use a different format or a different way of spacing the lines, or maybe a different notebook. And just the simple ambiguity of not knowing whether this is the way I was going to take notes forever meant I completely ruled out the idea of taking notes at all and decided it would be better to do nothing. So I was so obsessed with the idea of having clarification right now that I actually just didn't take any action whatsoever. Those who are able to tolerate a degree of ambiguity are able to advance much faster in learning and in life because they're able to gain more extensive knowledge and understanding, which may eventually clear up the ambiguity they previously experienced. But just like every other kind of mental model on this list, your toleration of ambiguity is something that can be cultivated over time. It's not something that we're born with or not born with. So over time, I've really tried to focus on the idea of when you're learning something or trying to get better at something, just because you don't have all the answers now does not mean that you should stop and wait until all those answers are in place in your head. You need to keep going sometimes just to uncover the answers further down the line. Now, ambiguity can make people feel really uncomfortable. Not having all the answers to something really makes some people want to just give up altogether, and I'm definitely one of those people. But if you can slowly train yourself to say, it's okay, some of the answers are going to come further down the road, then you can really develop at a much faster pace. Imagine you're reading a book and there are loads of words in the book that you don't know. Now, I think we all instinctively know that if you were to stop and look up every single definition, then you would never get through the book and it would slow you down, send you off on a million different tangents, and you would never end up learning the thing that you'd actually intended. However, if you just tolerate a little bit of that ambiguity and say, okay, if that word comes up another 2 or 3 times, then I'll look it up, then maybe you'd get through the book much faster. And those essential things that you really had to know would kind of present themselves over time. So sometimes tolerating a bit of ambiguity, not seeking to have all the answers right now, and having a bit of sort of intellectual patience is something that can enable us to progress much faster and discover new things and develop at a much faster rate. The key to cultivating a toleration of ambiguity is what we do when we encounter the unknowns. The best approach is not to stop, reach for a dictionary or Wikipedia and try to fill in the hole on our understanding. The key is to keep going. If the concept is important, it will reappear in a few pages, or indeed it may pop up somewhere else in a few days, maybe in a fresh context and in a way that helps us to understand it more. But in the intervening time, we keep learning, keep moving forward, and we don't allow that small obstacle to arrest our progress. So toleration of ambiguity isn't really about intelligence, it's much more about your emotional temperament and moderating that feeling of discomfort when something is unclear or feels unresolved. So the less this kind of feeling derails us, the more progress we make. It's also really important for our emotional well-being. As we know, a lot of things in life don't have a neat answer. Many of life's biggest questions go unresolved for months and years, sometimes forever. The dichotomy of control. So as we learn, our conception of the world gets bigger and bigger. We begin to see the world as a big, complex place, and one full of problems and contradictions. We learn of global atrocities, widespread inequality, faulty systems of government, and huge, seemingly unstoppable economic forces. This can lead to the feeling of overwhelm and helplessness, which can manifest as stress, anxiety, or often as the disaffected and ambivalent attitude that's become the stereotype of the adolescent. But learning to distinguish between the things that are in our control and out of our control is essential in developing what I'd call a proactive mindset, where you can take action on things that you can affect and let the other things pass you by. The dichotomy of control is an old idea. It goes back to the Stoics. Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius and others all spoke of dividing the phenomena of the world into controllables and uncontrollables. So the original texts written by the Stoics are pretty hard going, but if you want a little primer into their ideas, I'd recommend the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. There are plenty of cases of the application of the Stoic dichotomy of control in history that we can look to, where people have drawn strength from simply focusing on the things in life that are within their control. Circumstances where people had little control over their outcomes, but still managed to focus on the small number of things within their control and not to be defeated by the weight of those things outside of their control. A great example is Viktor Frankl, and the story of his life during and after the Holocaust, which he details in Man's Search for Meaning. So showing kids a few relevant examples of the dichotomy of control can be really valuable for building their sort of resilience in life, and to make sure that kids don't get overwhelmed and consumed by the many forces at play that are outside of the realm of their influence, and only focus on those small number of things that are going to help them progress in their lives moving forward. It teaches them that in any situation, there's always an action that can be taken by them, even if it's simply the reaction that they have inside to what's happening around them. Mistakes and failures are good. In school, we tend to learn about the lives of famous and successful people, and we hear all about their amazing discoveries and inventions and things like that, but we seldom hear about the failures that they have along the way. As I grew older, I read a lot more biographies and autobiographies, and I learned that a lot of these so-called successful people led lives riddled with setbacks and failures. Now, I think a lot of teachers pay lip service to the idea that, I encourage my kids to make mistakes, but in the time pressure of a real school situation, few of them really tolerate mistakes in the way that they claim. Now, this isn't their fault. Teachers have huge workloads and very restricted time. And often it's more time efficient to sort of guide the student towards the right answer than it is to let them make their own mistakes at their own pace. And so I think when we're dealing with kids, we need to develop what I would call a failure-friendly culture. And one way to do that is to illustrate examples of people who made amazing discoveries or had amazing achievements that appear to be mistakes at the time. Penicillin, chocolate chip cookies, microwave ovens, potato chips, and even the pacemaker are all things that were discovered when somebody made what initially was considered to be a mistake. I also think, in terms of encouraging kids to take risks and make more mistakes, it's useful to tell them the story of the 30 pots. There was once a pottery teacher called Brian. One month, he decided to split his class into 2 groups. Group A had to make a pot every day for 30 days, so 30 pots in total. Group B had to work on a single pot for the whole 30 days. At the end of the month, Brian judged the quality of the pots. Without exception, every one of the top 10 pots came from Group A, the guys that made 1 pot per day. None came from the group that focused on perfecting their single pot. Our fear of failure and our innate perfectionism is often what holds us back from achieving the things we want in life, from following our passions and starting out on those journeys we really want to finish. So it's vital to encourage kids to try things out as often as they can, and to never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So there you have it, 5 things that I wished I'd learned in school, this time focused around the idea of building kids' mindsets. In the next video in this little series, I'm going to move away from the theoretical and talk about 5 practical things that I think kids should be taught in school, or things they should learn much earlier on in their education. So in the meantime, if you haven't seen it already, here's the first video in this series, which is all about teaching kids how to learn and building their metacognitive skills to make them more effective learners. As always, I'm really interested to hear your experience, and maybe you received some of these kind of mindset coaching tips when you were in the education system. If so, then comment down below with what you were taught and whereabouts you were learning it. And click subscribe if you want to see the next one. Cheers.